Okay, greetings, good afternoon, good morning from wherever you might be across Canada and elsewhere. My name is Ige Igal. I'm the founder and CEO at Play for Dignity, which is a national nonprofit working at the intersection of sport, human rights, policy, and systems change. We're focused on how sport is governed, delivered, and resourced so that access, safety, and dignity is at the core of our sport ecosystem. I'm so happy to be having everyone here join the call and excited for the conversations that we are going to have later today. I have the privilege of moderating today, and I'm looking forward to it because we have a panel who lives this work every day, bringing exactly the range of topics, challenges, and solutions that the topic at hand, equity, diversity, inclusion, and Indigenous sport deserves. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that we're calling in and participating from many places here in Canada, and I'm calling in from Toronto, which is the traditional territories of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. This land in Toronto is part of Treaty 13 and the Williams Treaties, and it remains home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. We recognize, of course, that sport, play, and movement in these lands exists within ongoing structures of colonialism, and Indigenous communities have long used movement, games, and ceremony to build wellness, belonging, and resistance. So I encourage you to take a moment to reflect on where you're calling from and what Indigenous nations are traditional there to those lands. Welcome to the Future of Sport in Canada, insights related to equity, diversity, and inclusion in Indigenous sport. I just want to give you a quick orientation of how the conversation will go today. We have great panelists, as I've said before, so I'm going to quickly hand over to them for brief introductions, and then I will pose a question to each of our candidates, and they'll speak for a few minutes, and afterwards, we'll get into a conversation as well. So for introductions, given that we have everybody's bio in the package, we're going to be brief with introductions. And so I've already introduced myself. So I'll start with Andrea Carey, and then we'll go through around the rest of the panelists before we jump in. So Andrea, over to you for an introduction.
Thank you. Hello, folks. My name is Andrea Carey. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and elle, and I'm calling in today from territories of the Coast Salish peoples in what's known as Victoria. And I'm the founder and chief inclusion officer with Inclusion Incorporated. We do diversity, equity, and inclusion work across sport, but also across many other sectors. So we're able to bring those learnings into the work in the sports sector. And I'm also the executive director of the newly launched One Ability Games, which is an annual multi-sport, multi-disability event that takes place in Richmond with big aspirations to help shift cultures around disability inclusion across the country. Thanks so much.
Fantastic. Really excited to hear about the One Ability Games and everything else you've been working on. We'll go next to Daria.
Hi, my name is Daria Hikara Palmer. My pronouns are she, her. I'm in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and my role is with anti-racism sport, strategic initiatives, and partnership manager. And I'm also here on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional and current lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Asininu, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Happy to be with you all today.
Excellent. Over to JT.
Happy Thursday, everyone. My name is JT Sui. I currently serve as the Director of Culture and Sport with Football Ontario. Within my role, I oversee our provincial high performance programming, community partnerships. I've also had some experience around coach education and development. I think what's unique about my journey is I've come from a background in education as well, so I've really been able to see sport through multiple lenses, from community high school up to provincial, and really looking forward to listening and learning and from each of our panelists today. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, JT. Bruce.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you for the land acknowledgement there, again. I'm calling in from the Treaty 1 area and homeland of the uh, Red River Métis Nation, and of course the traditional territory of many Indigenous peoples. It's also where we have our water source from Treaty 3, and we get our most of our electricity from the Treaty 5 territory. Um, I'm the new founder of the Indigenous Sport Fund, and our vision is to foster healing, empowerment, and cultural renewal through the transformative power of sport. And just really excited to be here. And so thank you for the time.
Excellent. And we'll kick off and stay with you, Bruce, to start with Indigenous sport reconciliation and thinking through parallel systems. When we look at the Future of Sport Commission's report, it treated Indigenous sport, self-determination, and reconciliation. It clearly names settler colonialism as a foundational context and centers Indigenous self-determination. So if we take seriously, Bruce, that Indigenous sport isn't simply seeking inclusion within the mainstream sport system in Canada, but that it's a distinct system connected to rights, self-determination, jurisdiction, and community leadership, what would have to change in your mind in how Canadian sport institutions and organizations in the mainstream approach this partnership?
Well, thank you for the question. I think it's the question, I guess. I think first, just want to describe Indigenous sport as the double helix model. It's a visual representation of both Indigenous and mainstream sports as parallel systems that are connected through possible shared activities that create opportunities, in this case, for Indigenous athletes. But more importantly, as you mentioned, Indigenous sport affirms for us our cultural identity, and it promotes our health. It also strengthens our self-determination, and it carries a deep spiritual and healing significance for us. And then, of course, your question really poses the idea of what needs to maybe change. And I believe, like many systems, systems needs to transform. And so it needs to start with, in my mind, the ability to sort of confront our shared history through both truth telling and relationship building. And what I mean by that is there's this history where, like the Sport Commission and other areas that looked at that, I guess, shone a light on the darkness of sport and how it's harmed people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did the same for us in the sense that there was harm done, and we need to overcome that harm and that history. So confronting that truth, building better relationships is really the start of an acknowledgement of that history, but more importantly, how do we participate and act in that necessary healing in order to be better systems together, I guess. And for me, when you sort of, go down this tunnel of time and confront this history, I think you realize, yes, we need to support the self-determination of Indigenous people in their own forms of sport. But more importantly, I think we need to also look at how the systems in general need to work better together. And this double helix model is a great visualization of how these systems, although are independent and parallel to each other, there's an opportunity to sort of join these two separate helixes through cross strands, I guess. And in that case, there's possibilities for reconciliation activities that only maybe start with truth telling and relationship building. More importantly, look at how we could create more opportunities, more meaningful opportunities, not just for Indigenous athletes, but Canadians in general. I think there's nothing more connected than sport, as you know. I say, of course, a close second would be philanthropy. And I think both those systems need to support each other in order to sort of confront that shared history. The other thing I think it's important here is that there were 10 principles of reconciliation that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talked about. And of course, the first principle was to adopt the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People. So From a rights-based approach, I think it's important to recognize that Indigenous people through Article 31 of UNDRIP have a right to play, right to sport, traditional games and activities, but more importantly, a reconciliation framework could be a rights-based approach to how we look at sport in general. And I think the commission itself talked about this, and of course, how do we sort of have a principled approach to doing this? I think the challenge we have today, tomorrow, and in the future is how do we overcome this history, of course, as I mentioned. But I think the work that needs to be done in sport needs to look at how do we participate in that. Well, we need to share in our resources, our networks, and new ways of thinking. So I think the important part is how do we shift our thinking, and how do we do better, of course, in our systems in general. And I think a shift in thinking is a hard one to do because systems are hard to change. But if you look at system change, it's important to sort of shift your thinking in this area. And for me, in my short period of time, I've learned to unlearn, relearn, and then of course look at the opportunity. How do we sort of learn together in this area? And that's a challenge for many people, never mind trying to change systems, right? And so we have this, what I call an unprecedented opportunity, because historically we've had this disconnect. It's gone unrealized as far as opportunities in my mind. And here we are today talking about the very nature of how do we want to change these systems, and yet we still need to do more in that particular area. I can go on and on about this, but I think I might stop there to make sure everyone has time to speak.
That's a great foundation for us to build on. And I think the beautiful thing about the double helix is that, it's drawn from science, is a key component of a DNA, and you do need sort of both strands to actually kind of build on top of. So thank you so much for helping us to build that foundation, and lots for us to come back to. But I want to get to Andrea and start to think about inclusion, accessibility, and systems design as well. So, Andrea, you've been at this a long time, and we see that parallel sport systems such as disability sport, Indigenous sport, Bruce has given us a great read on that, gendered sport, and others exist because what we know as this traditional system was built for some populations and maybe not intentionally for others. Can you unpack this for us a little bit and tell us about what meaningful inclusion really requires?
Yeah, thanks. And Bruce, thanks for that great start, because I'm going to build on the double helix as I go through this. I think our default in the sports system has been exclusion. And to your point, Ege, like we had a sports system and a recreation system that were really built by certain populations for certain populations. And as we've gone through our history, we've tried to tack on other groups as we've realized that they're not included. And that fundamentally doesn't actually support people having meaningful engagement opportunities throughout our sports system. So I think the Future Sport Commission drew attention to that, but I think it was pieces, as we read it and went through that process, it was like, these are all things that I feel like I've already been living for a good section of my career. And the double helix is such a powerful example of two systems existing in parallel, and where there can be connection points. But at each of those connection points, there's a great number of barriers to that happening. And when I had the opportunity to work with Elder Alec Nelson, building out the double helix to go into the Indigenous long-term participant development pathway resource over a decade ago, and as we had those conversations and tried to think about how do we bring this to life for sport organizations and sport leaders to understand that, not by a fault of their own necessarily, but they've inherited this system that has excluded Indigenous participants. Thus, we created a parallel system for Indigenous participants, which is a thriving and beautiful system. And in our Canadian sport context, we have other parallel systems, the disability sports system. We have both Special Olympics and Paralympics happening in parallel to our Olympic system. We have men's and women's sport happening in parallel. And right now, our society is trying to wrestle with trans inclusion, and I think we're going to end up almost creating another parallel system if we don't do that thoughtfully, because again, we're working from a basis of exclusion instead of inclusion. And if we actually build with what do people need to be successful? How do we build a system that supports humans rather than a system that's based on how we keep people out? We could actually create the foundation for us to come together and to be more connected and build community, build shared values around that system, work from human rights, okay, to support people flourishing in our sports system. So I think we need to just really shift our mindset around that. And I think the topic of trans inclusion right now is such a massive opportunity to shift and to think about how do we build to support folks to be involved and to participate in the ways that work for them. So I think the piece that I kind of resonate on continually is like, rather than building for exclusion, let's build for inclusion. Start with yes. What does that look like? And one of the pieces that I was shared with a number of years ago that just resonates so strongly when I think about this work is that our colonial system said we built for. If we shift away to a decolonized approach, think about how we build with communities for the sports system they want to be a part of and co-create, and then transfer power so they're building it by themselves. And we can inform, support, be an ally in that, but ultimately that's the shift we're trying to make, is that for to with to by.
Mhm.
So maybe I'll
Yeah.
pause there.
Yeah, so much there, and I think the idea of design and building a system for humans, right? I think that's kind of the promise of sport, is that it is a tool that can help you to express yourself, but also to address multiple challenges. But if we don't build it for and with people, we don't get those outcomes. And I think that's a really important element to keep in mind. And when we do think about the ecosystem and how this is being built and implemented. I want to turn to JT to kind of talk about what that looks like from an organizational perspective, because given the broad set of challenges we've seen from the Future of Sport Commission and all of the 98 calls to action, ultimately it is sport organizations that are going to be asked to meet this higher standard on safety, on inclusion, on accountability. And often this is, as you very well know, an ecosystem that is heavily reliant on volunteers and under-resourced clubs. So JT, I wonder, how do we raise the standard without pretending that implementation is easy, but at the same time, without letting the idea of capacity constraints become an excuse for inaction? It's an interesting tension. So I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question, Ige, and sort of I love what Andrea shared about, how do we build systems that support humans and people that are doing the work. So I think that's um, sort of prompting ourselves with that question, I think is a powerful one. It's a simple one and a powerful one. And I think it's coming through the lens that when we look at issues in terms of implementation and intention and implementations, it's the idea of can we make decisions from a governance perspective that promote the well-being of the participants? Can we make decisions that promote the dignity of our participants? Can we make decisions that promote long-term sustainability with that, and sort of acknowledging the fact that it will be a constant work in progress. And I think when we sort of approach it through that lens with decisions that again promote well-being, dignity, and sustainability, we can start to look at this as a shared responsibility. And I think that's something I do my best to sort of approach anything is look at things through a shared responsibility lens. An example, a practical example right now is as an organization, as a provincial sport organization, we are fully immersed into, okay, how do we take those findings? How do we use this as an opportunity to better integrate safe sport policy and procedures and practices within our sport? And one thing we've looked at it as, recently we have been doing a coaching audit for our local associations and clubs. And part of that, the primary responsibility as a PSO, as the governing body, is to bear with, is performing some of those coaching audits, right? Some of the just looking into helping to support the local associations and clubs with, giving them a clear picture of where they stand right now. Where are their coaches? What certifications, what trainings have they completed? What have they not completed? So that's kind of the first step from a PSO. Now, once we share that information with our community sport organizations, it's then helping them to get a true, factual base on here's where we stand, right? Okay, we're missing here. Can we direct them? Can we drive them to this training? Can we get them here? So it's providing our community sport organizations with factual, up-to-date information. And then the last thing is, with our coaches, with our boots on the ground who do a lot, and as you mentioned, that a lot of it are many of our sports are driven by passionate, driven volunteers. It's, can we hold them accountable as well to, hey, you have, part of this responsibility about creating safe sport is we need your help in this. So it's, hey, we need to complete this. And I think what's been really interesting is this implementation hasn't been easy. There's been some good lessons. There's been a lot of good feedback, but we're better than where we started. And as we move forward, the one thing I've really taken away, which has been a pleasant surprise, is as how people have worked together from the PSO through club administrators down to the coaches to hold people accountable that, okay, this needs to get done by this mutually agreed upon deadline. And if not, we've had, community, coaches at the community level that, haven't been able to coach yet, right? So it's been interesting just to Andrew's point about sort of co-creating this. It's messy, it isn't easy, but, it's sort of understanding that, together we can make it better.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that example because it brings a few things together. It's this information, knowing exactly where you are, having a goal, how you're doing towards those. And, what I often find is usually missing is that accountability piece. So that fact that you've been able to actually, institute that, and the community sort of says, yeah, if you don't abide by these guidelines, you don't coach, I think is a powerful example of what, what some of the tools we can use are to ensure that inclusion is not something we simply talk about, but that we implement. And of course, we'll come back to unpacking some of this as well. But I want to give Daria an opportunity as well to kind of jump in here, and maybe pick up off what Andrea was saying about, building together, but, some of the words that I think are really important, in terms of power, and power dynamics also show up in some of the work that you do, Daria. I just want to sort of quote the Future of Sport Commission's report that states that racialized people are 3 times more likely to report experiencing unfair treatment, racism, or discrimination in community sport, which is, I know, something that you've been working on, and anti-racism in sport has been doing even before the Future of Sport Commission mentioned it. So when sport organizations say that they want to reach communities they've excluded, how do we avoid turning those communities into recruiting targets for existing systems rather than partners in sort of helping to redesign that system?
For sure. And building on, like you said, with what Andrew was saying about how are we building systems? How are we designing systems? And one of the biggest challenges that we face, or that organizations generally will be facing, is they often start with a solution rather than a relationship. And so when we're looking at a program getting developed and funding is secured and we have all these goals established, and then the organization asks, well, how do we get more diverse participants into this? The problem is that those communities can then tell that they're being invited into a system that wasn't really designed for them in mind, and they're being looked at as a target group as opposed to an inclusive piece of this system as a piece of it. And where this breaks down is that participation then becomes that measure of success rather than belonging or influence or even long-term engagement. And so we might get people through the door, but we haven't necessarily addressed the barriers that keep them out in the first place. So when we're talking about doing things differently, it really means engaging communities a lot earlier in that process. So before designing programs, organizations need to spend time listening. They need to spend time learning or unlearning. To Bruce, to your point, we do a lot of unlearning every single day because of the systems that we were built in, this colonized this colonized sports system that we're trying to decolonize. And really understanding what communities actually want and what do they need from sport. And sometimes the answer isn't a new program. Everyone wants to put, tie a bow on a nice new shiny program and say, we delivered this, and then they move on. But really, it might be, changes to structures, changes to fees, transportation supports, leadership representation, organizational culture, right? When we're looking at, what is sport in Canada, and really being humble to maybe that we don't have the answers. And so organizations that I've seen that make the most progress, and the ones that we've been working with, is shifting from asking how do we get communities into our system to how do we work with communities to create a system that works better for everyone. And like to Andrea's point, it's not about inviting more people into existing structures, because those structures work exactly as they're designed to. They are broken, but more so willing to examine and to reshape those structures alongside the people that they've historically left out. And so when we're looking at, we're looking at that type of relationship building and building projects around relationships rather than relationships around projects. The biggest piece is projects have timelines. Relationships don't have timelines. And so too often organizations are connecting with communities because they have a grant or they have funding or they have an initiative or a problem that they need help with solving, not that the community needs help with solving. And so when that project ends, that relationship fully disappears. So building projects around relationships really means investing in that trust before you need something. It means showing up consistently and connecting with communities in between initiatives, and not just when funding appears that they're going to do something because they want to latch on to an opportunity. Are you attending community events within your community? Are you meeting regularly with cultural organizations? Are you developing sustainable relationships with other organizations? Or do you have a new representative every single year trying to establish those relationships? And so as part of that, are you inviting leaders into ongoing planning discussions? And that's when we talk about who are we designing systems for? Are we expecting people to fit into our systems?
I think that's another really important point, and I want to maybe take a step back, and open it up to everybody here. First, thank you to the One Badge and ISB team for putting this on, because I think part of actually grappling with this massive report is talking through it, and understanding where we can take some of the calls to action and recommendations that come out of it. But a few of you have, in one way or another, said, it's less about kind of sort of redesigning the current system and thinking bigger and beyond that. So I want to maybe just do a quick temperature check in terms of the actual report itself and the calls to action and the substance in there, and ask a two-part question. One being, do you think there was anything missing from the report there? And then secondly, which of the calls to action are you really excited about? And does it provide this idea that we actually need to think about systems change more broadly? So I'll open this up to everybody if anyone's got some thoughts or ideas.
think one interesting piece is when it calls specifically to look out to developing strategies. A lot of what I think has been done are projects. And as much as we all love projects, I'm sure that most nonprofits despise projects because they have to be new and they have to always constantly change, and they're for a time-bound piece. And even if it's really successful, it's not guaranteed to continue because the next time they need funding, they have to have something new. They can't do something existing.
Mhm.
And so the calls to action, there are a few of them that calls for a broader strategy and looking instead of as things as silos, as like a one-time initiative, but more so about what is the strategy we're trying to move forward, and do these projects or programs or initiatives, are they meeting that strategy on a long-term basis so that you can have one phase or second phase or third phase as part of that instead of just, okay, great, we've checked a box, we've done this, now we're moving on to the next thing.
And I go back to what JT was saying earlier around accountability, right? You know, an implementation strategy allows for a component of accountability as well. Any other thoughts on, you know, the final report itself, some calls to action that you're either particularly excited about, or some broad general reflections? I think it's important, just given that's the foundation of our sort of coming together. Andrea, I see you want to chime in, and then we'll go to Bruce.
Yeah, sorry, I missed Bruce's hands up. Yeah, thanks, Daria. I think I agree that the strategy piece is interesting. I think what I would reflect on right now is that I hear sort of across the sports system, it's like, well, let's wait and see what they do. And I'm like, oh my gosh, there are so many people being excluded on a daily basis. I'm like, I don't want to wait and see what we're going to do. Like, let's keep doing the good work. Let's make sure that we're leaning in. And then as we develop those strategies, look at like what's the actual implementation of those strategies is such a crucial part for me, because we have so many strategies in this country that get created and then they sit there and no one does anything with them. And that's a bit of a frustration for me on an ongoing basis, because we need the strategy to just like have as that touch point and that guidance, but then we actually have to really focus on like, what is the implementation and how do we get this work done? How do we collaborate? How do we shift our funding structures to support the delivery and the implementation of those strategies, but not in the ways we've done it, because the ways we've done it have reinforced the silos and the exclusion that we're already navigating. So in doing this work, I think the real opportunity of the Future Sport Commission, and hopefully the opportunity of the new funding, if we do that smart, is to not give to the existing power structures and continue to perpetuate the systems of exclusion, but actually to shift how that's done, drive collaboration, drive change, drive the accountability as core principles, and drive the implementation of that change.
I want to quickly, you know, get your take on the idea of a centralized sport entity that has sort of come up across the entire report. Do you think that that's potentially, you know, a body that can help to achieve some of these objectives around inclusion, or do you want to kind of just think beyond that as well?
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. One is that to me, that comes out because we have a sports system that hasn't had leadership that's needed to drive change. So whether that's a Sport Canada issue or across kind of the MSOs that exist currently, there's obviously a gap
Multi-sport
there that was
organizations, yeah.
identified. So that, I think, centralizing, I'm going to say a number of the operations and the roles in the sports system is a really important piece. But again, I think it needs to be done in a way that like drives the actual shifts we need in the system. And I think that can be a new entity, or it can be a revamping, reimagining, a shift. But the voices of those that haven't been at the table need to be at the table in order for that to be successful to make the change as well.
Yeah, whatever it is, you know, I think that's an essential component. Bruce, you had your hand up, so I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I think well, two things. One, obviously, the commission's findings highlighted the widespread and systemic harm in sport and called for many different types of actions. And of course, to your earlier question about, one of the recommendations, and of course, it talked about increasing public investment in sport, and of course, for Indigenous peoples, how do we ensure that sport systems are inclusive of Indigenous perspectives? And so my answer sort of lies in what the panel has been saying here. And, I heard, power, decision making, accountability in communities, and for me, and the work that it, is in front of me and many others, is that there needs to be an undergoing of this acknowledgement of this harm, and how do we confront it, not just from a public perspective, but and of course I have to just mention philanthropically for a moment, even how wealth was built in the case of appropriations of Indigenous lands, resources, or labor. And then, of course, how this history has contributed to the longstanding exclusion and real underinvestment of Indigenous communities, and particular Indigenous sport for that matter. And so, for me, how do we move beyond this traditional notion of not only just giving back or including us? I think it demands an approach that addresses this power, in my case, colonial power, that has been an imbalance, and support more just and more equitable future. And so that means that you need to shift that power, give up that power, and then have communities decide on what's important to them, which is a huge shift, not only in thinking, but in system change as well, as and everyone's been saying it in one form or fashion here on this panel. So I'll just sort of, collect those thoughts in that way. And so for me, as mentioned earlier, it's rooted in this truth telling, and how do we overcome this historical harms and current harms for that matter, and then how do we sort of move towards system that is more about repairing and restoring relationships that have been harmed, obviously, and we need to offer a transformative alternative. Daria was mentioned about the transactional action of projects, and we need to maybe look at more transformation. And so, obviously, traditional giving or traditional federal investments are not necessarily, they've been project based and not have been sustainable. And so we need to look more about positioning sport more as a unifying force, in our case, for healing and cultural revitalization and self-determination. But more importantly, again, as I mentioned, we need to uplift our community voices and ensure that they decide what that future is. And that's where the public accountability lies, and it lies in our community. And I think that total shift is something that's very hard to comprehend.
Yeah, it will take a lot of work. It will take the strategy, as Daria was mentioning earlier. And I know that there is the Aboriginal Sport Council's strategy that was just released as well. And would love, if we have time, would love to come back to you on that. And I think you also mentioned something that's very critical, which is the money, and what the role of money is in achieving some of these in enabling some of these outcomes in inclusion that we want to see. Of course, there's a big question mark around the $755 million and how that's going to sort of be implemented. And I'll just put a pin in that and come back to it. But for now, I would love to go to JT and get your take.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I was thinking when Dario was talking about sort of this, very siloed approach within sport, right? And then hearing these themes around funding, I had a crucial conversation, a difficult conversation with a coach in our space who very experienced, has coached at multiple levels, has seen it through, and has given a lot of time and energy, decades. And, one of the questions was around a theme that came up was, a feeling of disrespect, like that just what is being asked of them is just, it's like, it's the straw that broke the camel's back. And, it was a conversation where, listening to this perspective, it was, I found it was uncomfortable, but it was a gift because you start to understand that although we tried to be as proactive with communication, like months in advance, you have a month to get this done. Still, there was this like, at what point do we need to push back? Right? Was sort of the question, asked of me. Like, at what point do we need to push back on what we expect of coaches and volunteers? And it was a really interesting conversation, a really powerful one that just got to expect that we acknowledge within sport that across sports, how can we better align what expectations we have of coaches and volunteers, right? I think through my parents' lens, if I want to go coach, my son in his sport, and is it the same? Or am I going to be expected to have totally different, which, that's a barrier for some people, right? So how can we better align what's expected of coaches, right? In terms of, making sure that, yes, they have their background checks, that they have certain trainings and certifications to understand, but can we better align that across the sport ecosystem? And then from there, maybe that starts to evolve the conversation of people feeling just more respected of their time and the energy they're investing. And to the point around which we've also talked around the funding piece, maybe that allows us to be better financial stewards as leaders to make sure that the funding that we do get has the biggest impact with the people, boots on the ground, that are doing the work to make our spaces more inclusive.
Yeah. That's a really interesting tension. I want to get to Daria in a second, but maybe staying with this tension of individuals with good intentions, at the grassroots level, versus sort of a system, right? And thinking through what are the incentive structures in the system that we have that govern behavior, right? And so how do we understand certain types of behavior as sort of being an outcome of, the way the system has been designed, which all of you have mentioned in one form or another. So, JT may be thinking specifically about this challenge, and about this major announcement that we've seen of $755 million. Not to sort of put you on the spot, but where would you like to see that investment go to enable folks, in delivery to actually work towards these outcomes? So what do we need to start telling Sport Canada, the Secretary of Sport, in terms of how that funding is invested to achieve inclusion outcomes?
We need to invest in coaches, and not the professional organizations. Like, obviously as a PSO, we have different access to resources. I'm talking about communities that are underrepresented, that are racialized, that are marginalized, that might not have the access. Like, we need to invest it and figure out where can the money have the biggest impact? Where can we support meaningful change? So I think, and I think that requires a deeper conversation that's not just, myself as a PSO administrator determining where that is. I think that's engaging other leaders.
Yeah. Right. Daria, I know you've been patiently waiting to get in, so go over to you
No worries.
on this.
I actually now I have 2 points because I want to also build onto what GT was saying, just on, investing in coaches, is that we have, $750 million, and we're treating sport professionally if we're investing that kind of money, yet we're not treating the people who work in sport as professionals. And one of the biggest barriers that we face, as part of our anti-racism training, which we've delivered to several thousand people, we could deliver to several thousand more. The problem is they have to take so many courses for certification, to register as a coach, to upkeep their coaching licenses, but they're volunteer coaches. So why are we putting on all of these professional designations and requirements, but we're not treating them like professionals, to JT's point? And so, it's we're having an expectation that we're not even meeting ourselves on them, that we're not even meeting ourselves. And I say ourselves as in like the sport system. So as part of that investment, we also really need to have a hard look at, what are we looking as sport? Is sport like similar how we look at a teacher? Or are we saying, oh, sport is just someone that babysits our kids and doesn't need any type of professional training? It has to take 12 different certifications in a year. So I think that just needs a review in how we look at that. The other piece that I wanted to also address is, when we look back to the report and the recommendations that come in for the calls to action, and when we talk about strategy, we also talk about implementation, to Andrea's point, but it's the what versus the how. Right. And so I think that also needs to be kept in mind too. Like when we talked about, transactional versus transformational, Bruce and I have talked about this before, and Bruce is, always highlights, how do we have transformation as part of the concept? I don't want to put words in your mouth, Bruce, but I know we've talked about this quite often, and how, transactional sort of engagements is more like us saying, how can this community help us to achieve our goals? So this document, we're saying, okay, community, come help us achieve this, right? Instead of going to a partnership, a transformational partnership that's really looking as to how can we work to achieve our shared goals. And I think the difference between that is going to come down to power and trust, and to JT's point, accountability as well. And, and understanding that maybe these organizations aren't the ones who are going to be steering the ship. They own the ship, but should they be steering that ship, and have the humility and be humble enough to say, okay, I know that there's experts who are, to understand that the experts, and treating community as experts in their own needs, instead of applying what we think those community needs. And so that's just maybe a reframing of the how of the what.
Yeah, there's a few things, I want to pick up on, and it's your question, Daria, around what is sport for? What outcomes do we actually achieve through sport? And in our place, Playful didn't even talk about sport, play, and movement and physical activity as being part of that. And does the investment that we have meet the need, but also the potential for the tool? Maybe I'll go over to Andrea for this one, and think through, like, how do you think about this kind of massive investment, and how we're treating sport, play, movement as well in the context of inclusion? Is it enough?
Yeah, it's funny. I spent so much time sort of in the national sports system, and then I was like, I feel like I need to be out of it to help like facilitate the change I actually want to see. And so when I say that, I think about like, I love being like, yesterday I was in a classroom working with kids delivering sport, adapted sport, and like being there and seeing that and reminding myself of that joy is so important, to know how to like influence some of the other pieces. And I just use that as a little example, because schools to me are such a missed opportunity in our sports system. We have not done a good job both building relationships with sport, across sport, recreation, and education. And I truly believe that has to shift if we want to make some of the changes across our sports system that need to happen. We know schools are the most accessible place for kids to get sport. We know that schools are also tapped out in terms of resources. And so how do we like build these collaborations to actually shift how we're delivering? And that has been such an intentional part of what we're doing with the One Ability Games. To come back to that example, is that we know that kids with disabilities aren't getting the opportunities to play sport. People with disabilities aren't getting the opportunities to play sport. And so we're actually intentionally building relationships with schools to go, we're going to help build your capacity to deliver more inclusive programming in schools around adapted sport, so that you can do that on an ongoing basis, with this sort of marker in time of both the One Ability Games, as well as we're building regional sporting events across the province. So it's like they have a time marker to work towards, similar to what we see with any sort of games, other games in our ecosystem, whether it be NAIG or Paralympics or Special O, but it's like that marker in time drives shifts. And so we've been super intentional about that, giving the educators resources that are built by other educators that are built on our existing sport resources. So we're drawing from that, but like making it a lot simpler to deliver. And we busted, I'm going to say, two myths that I've held in my career. One is it's hard to get sport in schools, and it's hard to find kids with disabilities. And both of those, we like blew through those this year. And the population of people with disabilities is growing rapidly. We're at 27% of the population right now. It's predicted we're going to go to 45% of the population by 2050. Like, this is everyone's issue. If you're not thinking about people with disabilities in your sports system, you're literally going to be missing out on half the population. We can have the same conversation about some of the other populations in Canada. Like, our demographics are shifting, and we have to figure out new ways of doing things that are going to shift with it and build through collaborations along the way, I deeply believe.
Yeah. I think that's myth busting is, one very essential thing when we think back to what Bruce was saying earlier around new ways of thinking and provocations, right? Like what an opportunity where we are with this report and, the potential for this funding to think differently and not do things the same way that we've always done. I'm conscious of time. We've got about 7 minutes in the sort of regularly scheduled program portion, but I know you all are okay to go over a little bit. So maybe just a couple of questions to kind of close us out. Maybe we will think, I'm just sort of looking at my list here, thinking into the future. If we came back in 5 years, right? What would we look at to know that inclusion had actually change the system, or the system is more inclusive, and we haven't just changed language or added more checkbox exercises? What would be the indicator for you that we would have succeeded in inclusion? Maybe we'll start with you, Bruce.
Sure. I think for me, I envision a future where the government of Canada, and of course through Sport Canada and its investments, think and do differently. Of course, I look at how some of this public investment could create, as Andrew and others have mentioned, a culture cross-sector collaboration, right? More like, for example, what is the role of philanthropy, corporate Canada, right? There is a huge acknowledgement of our shared history through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's been a philanthropic community's declaration of action that was a response to the TRC in 2015, and it's been 11 years and it's moved millions of dollars differently to help support the necessary healing and reconciliation in this country to be more just, equitable, inclusive. So that can be done with sport as well. I'm involved with a group, where we'll be announcing a corporate declaration of action in the fall here in Winnipeg around October 6th and 7th with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And so, these are big movements that need to sort of shift how we look at resources, not just public investment, but also maybe public-private partnerships in a way that think and do differently. But more importantly, I also see, from the comments from the panelists here too, that it's done where community knows what community needs, and we meet community where they're at, and they'll decide what that is. And so shifting both the power, the decision making, but more importantly, the redistribution of resources to them themselves, those who have been harmed in a reparative way, will restore and repair those relationships. And so in general, I think that's how. I know that's a lot in 5 years, but I think that's my wish list.
Yeah. And do we need to shift what we mean by sport and how sport looks like to be able to achieve that?
Yeah, I think I'll just quickly say yes is the short answer, right? We talked about here, about, recreation. We talked about young kids and play. Of course, play, like sport has been described as a manifestation of play. I think, we need to look at how communities, in this case, Indigenous communities, look at sport as medicine, for example. It's integral to cultural identity. I'm looking specifically how sport can be a powerful enabler for the necessary healing in our community. And so I think it needs to be looked at differently, but that's done in for and by community. And so I think that's the big shift for government to look at, and that is to shift the way it thinks, the way it does, and how it holds the community accountable.
Excellent. JT, over to you. So,
Yeah, it's interesting because I noticed my answer on this would have been a little bit different. So I guess for myself, I realized that there's some learnings that have been going on. I think the pragmatic side of me looks at it in terms of, if we look at it through, the growth of those participating, the retention within sport, but then, as I hear some of my fellow panelists going, okay, where are those numbers coming from? Are they just coming from the same populations and the same communities? Then are we really being more inclusive? So I think there's a part of me that wants to definitely reflect on that. I think one thing we often talk about within our community, specifically for our provincial high performance program, is this philosophy of leave it better. And what that is, it's around this culture of respect people, respect places, respect the jersey. So I think from an inclusion perspective is are our participants leaving it better, right? Are they leaving feeling enriched? Are they leaving with a greater sense of belonging to sport? So I think that's, again, I know that's not always easy to measure, but I think subjectively, if people are leaving sport and leaving it better, I think that would be, for me, the eternal optimist in me, a great sign of sport becoming more inclusive.
yeah, you hit on one of the main things coming out of this report that kind of has a downstream effect on inclusion, participation, and everything, and that's culture, right? How to build sort of open, positive, welcoming cultures, and that's not something that happens overnight. It's a generational challenge, and I think, in conversations like this and really thinking about positioning that more forward, we might be able to get there. But maybe we'll kind of get a sense from Daria, what do you see 5 years from now? Or what would you like to see if we're looking back at this conversation that we would have achieved?
For sure. I think I would combine a little bit of what JT and Bruce were saying, about when we're looking at like numbers of who's participating, but also the quality of that participation as well. And to me, I'll always go back to the data because for us, the data has been so foundational in understanding of where the gaps are. So I hope in 5 years, we know who's participating in sport. We have that disaggregated data because very few 99% of sport organizations don't collect disaggregated data. So they don't know who's there. They don't know who's missing. They don't know where the gaps are. So who's coaching, who's officiating, who's leading those organizations, who's at the decision-making tables, right? In 5 years, are we going to see a difference? We have to start collecting that data now. But not only that, but do participants from these historically marginalized communities, do they report feeling safe? Do they report feeling welcomed and valued? And do they feel that sense of belonging? I think is the big piece is belonging is a huge part of this, is that in 5 years, are we going to have a community of sport that says, I belong in sport? And not just, do I have an inclusion strategy, which is great to have. But again, implementation of those is what are the impacts of it? And I've been, very fortunate to have been a part of, recreation to high performance sport to coaching to officiating to, in PSO, working in PSOs administratively, to really have maybe a bigger view on what sport is sport isn't just, a physical activity in a competitive environment, but it's health, it's well-being, it's education, it's belonging, it's community development. It's a tool that I think anyone who is a coach understands that they're not just developing an athlete, but they're working to provide people with skills to be a healthy and positive contributor to our society as a whole in our country. So if we take a step back and say, oh, this is just sport, well, it's not just sport. It's bigger than sport. It's 99% of people are going to participate in any type of form of recreation. So how are we preparing those people to be a part of our community?
Yeah. Great. I think, yeah, again, some great insights there. And, I'm going to resist the urge to ask the question, why do we think about sport differently if that's what we know as the fact? But maybe I'll go over to Andrea for your perspective, thinking forward 5 years from now.
Yeah, and Daria, thanks so much for pointing to the data because in our work in Inclusion Incorporated with national sport organizations over the last several years, we've done multiple surveys and learned some really great pieces, but then there's no sustained funding for them to continue to do those. And I think that is a gap and one that we could close if we worked together and collaborated on a system survey that everyone had access to. I
Mm,
think our registration systems are also really deeply flawed in how we collect information and share that information. So I think there's some strategies there that could be really helpful in terms of getting some more sustained information about who's in the system and who's not.
mm,
And then I want to go to sort of like, I always have this piece around like the egos and logos and just thinking about like sort of who's in the room, who's not in the room, how they're controlling the space in the rooms. And I think the dollars right now scares me a little bit because I think there's so much jockeying for position for the dollars that I
mm,
worry deeply that it will go to some of the same and we won't actually make some of the cultural shifts we need.
mm,
And I think my sort of final point to go back to your initial question, Iggy, is like, what do I want to see in 5 years? I actually want to see that we have the population of Canada reflected in who's participating in our sports systems at every level. And we don't see that right now on our high performance teams. We don't see it at the Olympics and Paralympics and Special
mm,
Olympics. And we know that, kind of back to our initial piece that Bruce shared with us around the double helix, there are so many barriers to go across the different parallel systems. And so the investments need to be around how we shift that and make sport across this country more accessible because from grassroots to high performance right now, our sports system is becoming unaffordable. And that's
yeah.
just one layer of barrier that we're navigating. And so, again, to my earlier point, we need to go back to how are we collaborating across systems to actually make sport more accessible on an ongoing basis to help build sport as a tool for a better society.
And that's a fantastic note for us to, pause on. And I want to maybe just in kind of closing the loop in where we started with the double helix model. We really are, when we talk about inclusion, but also the double helix model, thinking about question really is what is the DNA of our new sports system and what's our role in kind of bringing that to life. And if it is a double helix model, we've got, multiple systems that exist and kind of bringing them together. And if it is about new ways of thinking, I think, Andrea, your point around, the fact that in Canada, public education is a right and every young person in Canada has a right to education. Well, that seems to me like an obvious place to start. So I want to make sure that that's not forgotten. So we could talk for, days on this, but I want to pause and see if there's any questions from our participants who, remain still in the room. Looking here, I see that Nat has a question. Nat Severino, how do we promote long-term participation, not only in playing the sport, but coaching pathways to ensure that participants see themselves in leadership roles as well. So this is just ensuring access to leadership and decision making roles. So I'll leave this one open if anyone has wants to sort of jump in on it, whether from experience or some ideas that you're exploring.
I think a lot of PSOs, at least from my experiences, there isn't always a formal pathway, right? So you'll
Mm,
have athletes who drop out for various different reasons in competitive sport, and like that, we start with a big pool of athletes when you have recreation sport, and then as you get more competitive, there's different choices that are made, or different barriers also that are presented, so stops people from being able to continue into the sport, and they think, if I'm not an athlete, I'm not part of this sport. And so maybe formalizing some more of those pathways, I think, is really important, and not just waiting for someone to show an interest or ask about it, but tapping shoulders and ensuring that at every part of the development of an athlete, you're not just thinking of them as an output of results, but you're also thinking about them as part of a community, and reshifting our views on athlete participation in sport.
Yeah. I think also, if I may, you raised the question or the comment earlier, Daria, around thinking about, volunteers in sport as professionals, right? And putting a value on the work that they do. One way to open those recruitment pathways is to ensure that people can, make a living doing this. If we value it as a public good, then someone should be able to kind of think about, okay, well, I don't have to, because not everybody has the luxury to kind of to volunteer as well. Unless anyone else wants to jump in on that one, I'll check if there's any other questions here. I think that's it from the chat, and I'm sorry if I'm not seeing any other questions. I see that we will send a recording if you were interested. So this really brings me to the close of this fantastic discussion with our panelists. Thank you so much for all of your contributions and ideas as we look forward to moving forward the calls to action from the Future of Sport in Canada Commission. We've been saying it so often in the last 18 months that I'm tripping over it now. So really appreciate your inputs there. I just want to thank also the team from One Badge and ISB for organizing this series, actually, and encourage everyone to tune into the next ones that you saw on the previous slide. And I think one way that we do improve, or maybe I'll just quickly name them as they're back here. The next one is on safe sport, prevention, response, and accountability, which, as everyone knows, safe sport was one of the main reasons why the commission was struck in the first place. And then secondly, picking up some of the themes from this conversation on access, participation, and grassroots sport, and thinking about how we build from the bottom up could be a really interesting conversation, particularly because the question of where some of that new funding is going has not been answered yet. So you can scan the QR codes there to get registered, and hope to see you on those calls again. But I think the other piece is that's really important for the not just for the organizers, but for all of us, is your feedback. If you can take a few minutes to scan the QR code and provide us with your feedback, we would greatly appreciate it. And last but not least, a thank you to all of our participants who've joined from across the country and stayed even as we've kind of gone over time. So that's where we'll have to leave it. I suspect many of the threads that we started in this conversation will continue. Once again, thanks to the panel, Bruce, Andrea, JT, Daria, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about. And I think one of the objectives we had as a group here is to move beyond this idea of inclusion matters, and you've certainly moved us in that direction in thinking about changing the relationships, the resources, the power, the standards, and accountability that's required to be able to get there as well. And a final word of thanks to the One Badge sport team for hosting today's conversation on the Future of Sport series. So with that, I wish you all a great day, and go Canada. All the very best.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.